responses to challenges and support mechanisms, and possibly who should lead the promotion and implementation efforts?
Well, Xiang Hui has mentioned the role of chambers of commerce, and indeed they have a lot of activities to undertake when training and supporting the creation of SMEs in our regions. In particular, they are only speaking about the term, the word of competence, and they are wording this competence as the possibility for small and medium enterprises to be able to deal with larger corporations, particularly in the face of free trade agreements that has been signed between Latin American countries, North America, or even the European Union. And we think that beyond that, we have to take into consideration that human rights could be a very important and necessary tool to be included in these training courses for those who want to start SME in Latin America. On the other hand, I think the government has an important role too. Governments are the ones that approve and provide the permits for the operation of any company. So they have a very strong role, and they have to also coordinate in terms of understanding human rights, not only in terms of child labor or gender balance, but also in terms of fair labor and decent jobs that unfortunately some governments are passing laws against this possibility. For instance, in the recent case of Mexico, where there is subcontractors that really benefit from subcontracting and paying very, very bad salaries to their workers. At the same time, the Global Compact has something to do, and we have seen very interesting and really hopeful initiatives coming from the Global Compact networks, local and national networks in Latin America. Particularly in my country, in Colombia, they have created a human rights group in which some SMEs are participating, and they are providing insights and learning together with large companies on what are the basis for these fundamental human rights for this type of companies. So it is not a matter of image, it is not a matter of competence, it is a matter of respecting the rights of those that work to create wellness in all of our countries.
Thank you very much. Shafi, very briefly before we move on to the respondent.
Yes, in terms of support mechanisms, things that I see that can work. First of all, we need to create awareness and domesticate the guiding principles by, among others, customizing them into local, I would say local perspectives. We'd also popularize them amongst businesses, both SMEs as well as the big companies, and also embark on sensitization campaigns using local tools. In Uganda, we have something popular. We call them information, education, and communication charts that we send out to companies about a given subject. These are very, very effective when companies hang them and educate the employees about what the charts are all about. But it's also important, I think, in my view, to take this debate back to these SMEs. When you ask them a question about these guiding principles, about human rights, it gives them food for thought. The best way of testing as to whether a student has understood a topic is by asking a question about that same topic. So if they see this question, it will create awareness about what you're talking about. So we need to create a baseline of sorts. If we could do a baseline amongst these SMEs to understand how they conceptualize or how they understand these guiding principles of business and human rights, to also play a great deal in supporting mechanisms that we can do to implement. Now, on to the question of who should lead promotion and implementation efforts. I think the business associations here would play a big role, but now the Global Compact Local Network also come in handy, just following up on the various initiatives that we have started wherever we operate.
Thank you very much. I just got an indication from Tom and Brent that they would like to intervene briefly, so 1 minute each, please.
Thank you, Alex. Just on this question of how to overcome some of these challenges, I think we need to ask ourselves very carefully, who are the most influential messengers with people who own or manage small and medium-sized enterprises? It's probably not executives from large enterprises. It's probably not government officials. It's certainly not people like me working for international organizations. The answer probably is other people who work in or own or manage small and medium-sized enterprises. So any attempts that can try to bring similar businesses together to learn from one another is likely to be one of the most fruitful ways of building capacity, I think.
Excellent note. Brent, please.
Given that human rights are not just something that people get when they go to work, human rights exist within the society, there's a big role for education. We've heard of top-down, but there's also bottom-up. People know what their rights are, then they can start having a dialogue about the realization of those rights. If no one knows anything, then you're not going to have a conversation. So both the education system has a role to play, as well as these other initiatives that have been put out there. But the other thing is simple messaging, and one that I use quite a bit in the developing countries when I go and talk about industrial relations or human rights is treat people as you would like to be treated yourself. There's not a bad message to send through in terms of getting people to understand the context within which they now have to operate. You cannot act unfairly. You must be treating people as you would want to be treated yourself. So simple messaging like that, I think, is an important way forward, and using the media, as I mentioned before, is another thing.
Thank you. I think Ricardo now has a very difficult task to try to summarize some of the key messages. But please do give it a try in 5 minutes.
Thanks. I'll try to pare down my can you hear me? Yeah. I'll try to pare down my remarks because there's a surprising amount of consensus among the speakers. When you try to plan your remarks as a respondent, you anticipate what people are going to say, and in this case, many of those things really have come to fruition. So I'm pleased that the ILO was invited to participate as part of this panel. As you know, and Brent reinforced, the ILO has a unique tripartite structure and works with states, business enterprises, and trade unions to promote the implementation of international labor standards that, among other human rights, are part of the normative content of the guiding principles. We provide a range of support to all the stakeholders in relation to business and human rights. We follow up with member states on their ratification of conventions and work on capacity building of governments, employer and worker organizations on these standards. We also have a help desk for business and provide individual support or responses on the challenges that they face. And so we have some experience and insight into some of the challenges that businesses face. Trade unions and employer organizations have strongly endorsed the guiding principles, particularly for having clearly defined the distinct roles of government and business, as well as for highlighting the importance of effective grievance mechanisms. Employer organizations and trade unions have an important role to play in promoting the guiding principles, but both, perhaps for different reasons, would emphasize that these efforts should not and cannot replace the duty of the state to provide adequate protection and remedy for human rights abuses. Rule of law is critical to an enabling environment for SMEs and the workers that they employ. I just want to reinforce that message. It comes up in context of MNEs, but it's just equally important and maybe more so for SMEs. So during this session, there were a number of challenges which were explored and how we can meet those challenges. These included that there are a huge number of SMEs to be reached, and they are diverse. And how can one reach them all? How do we communicate effectively with them? We heard some numbers, but when reviewing this again, it's almost shocking, the statistics. Worldwide, the vast majority of business entities are SMEs, and at least half the population, depending on which number you look at, usually it's more, is working in an SME. And in Europe, for example, 99% of business entities are defined as SMEs. 90% of those are micro enterprises employing 10 or less people. In the US, the figures are even more astounding, that 60 million, or 70% of all business entities, are self-employed persons with no payroll. So, you know, the jargon and who are these entities we're talking about really is a diverse group. Second, and not unrelated to the diversity of what is considered an SME, is the awareness of guiding principles is one issue, but of human rights overall. The awareness is very low, and I would argue that this is not only true for SMEs, but also in many MNEs and, of course, the population at large. The language associated with human rights is not easily understood, or it's misunderstood by the general public, and this is also true for core labor rights. We see that all the time. So from my experience, this is true across all geographies, professions, and levels of democracy. It often requires a high level of contextualization to make it be seen as relevant to the individuals involved and to the companies involved. And that came out here again. There's also an issue that maybe we didn't touch upon so much, but balancing expectations. Raising awareness of human rights without providing the necessary remedy is a challenge for policymakers. As we heard yesterday, brave champions of human rights can easily be gunned down by bullets, but not prosecuted. Or what about the children who are expelled from jobs in factories only to remain hungry on the streets? Without access to remedy or adequate social protection for an exploited child, rights can easily lose their value in the eyes of those who they aim to protect. So I just wanted to come back to some of those core issues. Other questions raised here this morning: what are the drivers to incentivize attention and good practice with respect to human rights in SMEs? Is a business case always needed? And I think that discussion was had in the previous session with MNEs, and I think that the jury was that it may not be. So quickly on the solution side, and coming back to John Ruggi's comments yesterday, an investment in capacity building is needed, and I think we've all agreed on that. Government capacity building. There are more complicated questions about reaching SMEs than just the sheer number of them. SMEs may in some cases be perpetrators of human rights violations, but in some jurisdictions they are also likely to be victims of abuse. They are likely to be disproportionately and adversely affected where rule of law is weak and the burden of corruption challenges their opportunity to grow and thrive. So in this context, for the ILO, the Human Rights Commission, the working group, there needs to be an appropriate emphasis on Pillar 1 to ensure greater protection by the state and to create an enabling environment where businesses can operate in an environment that recognizes and protects human rights. Governments should be encouraged to foster a culture of human rights through adequate inclusion in the curricula of basic education, and I'm glad to hear others mention that several times this morning. How can we go downstream with this information if people don't know what a human right is? Isn't going to a guiding principle maybe a step up too far? Business capacity building. Employer organizations, at least in my view, play an important role in providing a voice for SMEs when government fails to protect, but they also play an important role in disseminating information to their members. That came up several times. Another important opportunity is management education. This can be an excellent channel for reaching SMEs. More than 12,000 institutions today issue MBAs. Many of those are in emerging economies, and a lot of the future business leaders for family-owned businesses, SMEs and cooperatives do attend business schools. So including the guiding principles on human rights, including core labor rights, provides an excellent foundation for reaching tomorrow's business leaders. We didn't talk about that too much, I did add that. Drivers, the business case, so we mentioned that, and I'll wrap up quickly. as we say, human rights are normative and apply whether or not there is a so-called business case, and I'm glad to hear that even businesses have concurred with that earlier. However, the guiding principle sets new standards for businesses of all sizes to recognize and be accountable for their impacts. As businesses learn to measure and report on their impacts, they may well begin to recognize the costs associated with doing the wrong thing. Whether or not we can say that there's evidence that a socially sustainable supply chain is a competitive advantage, we don't know that the converse is true, that being non-sustainable is a competitive advantage. So I think the case may well be there. We have to start getting the data. And then in terms of prioritizing who to reach, coming back to the 99% of business entities that are all SMEs and very small ones, with such a large task ahead, there is a need to prioritize. There are definitely sectors that derive maximum profits during very short cycles. For this reason, there is cause for civil society and governments to be vigilant and to provide a level playing field for those operating within those high-risk sectors who are operating within the accepted standards. So finally, I'd like to leave on a high note about the importance of SMEs. These are, as Brent mentioned, these are businesses in your communities, and the vast majority of owners and managers of smaller businesses aim to do well by their employees and by the communities that they live in. In some cases, when introduced in a sensitive manner, the new tools made available via guiding principle campaigns, whether that be the EU guide or the IOE guide or others, may raise their awareness, inspire them to fulfill their positive role they can play in their community. And once on board, these leaders may punch well above their weight. Unlike some other CEOs, the owner-manager is less likely to be kicked out. So there is a silver lining. So the ILO looks forward to working with the Human Rights Commission and the working group on promoting this, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ricarda, for that detailed summary of the discussion. Now the floor is open to you. We have a number of questions that have been asked. Let's start taking two of those. The first one is from ICC Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Is that person in the room?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, please.
So I have a comment to share. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
But please stick to 2 minutes maximum.
Yes, okay. So I'm speaking today on behalf of the Canadian Human Rights Commission in its capacity as the chair of the ICC Working Group on Business and Human Rights. The ICC is the International Association of National Human Rights Institutions. And a brief message that I wish to relay is that it's an invitation to business enterprises, regardless of your size, to consider national human rights institutions as a source of support as you develop your roles and practices for respecting human rights. NHRIs exist in over 100 countries worldwide and have been working before the implementation of the United Nations Guiding Principles in advancing human rights with governments as well as businesses and others. The relationship with NHRIs and human rights was reaffirmed recently in a declaration in 2010, where we have put our commitment into action. And the critical role of NHRIs has been recognized across all three pillars of the UN Protect, Respect and Remedy framework, as well as in subsequent UN resolutions. So again, NHRIs are a resource that are here to help businesses to understand the domestic human rights context, the institutions and key issues where you operate, as per Guiding Principle 23. And as part of your due diligence processes, it may be useful to learn more about and reach out to the national human rights institutions that are in the countries where businesses operate, not only in terms of good international practice, but also as a matter of compliance with domestic human rights laws and policies. So just briefly to summarize, again, NHRIs are experts on domestic human rights law and context, and a great deal of our existing work can and should be understood as relevant to business and human rights. In addition to having a mandate to resolve complaints and to provide access to remedies, NHRI should also be viewed as a resource to businesses to strengthen your due diligence processes and proactively address human rights issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that note. I would like to invite the International Trade Union Confederation, White Justice. Okay.
I was intrigued by something Brent said about the idea of pushing responsibility down the supply chain. One of the problems that we encounter is that employers are divesting themselves of the responsibilities of the employer by contracting out work or organizing business differently, and so it's sort of a different way of looking at something. But in any event, whether you are at one end of the supply chain or another, this whole idea and the principles of the various responsibilities you have for your business relationships, whether you might cause an adverse impact, whether you contribute to it, or whether it might be linked to it. And I think that in considering small and medium enterprises, that's one of the things we have to look at. Now, the other thing, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing the relationship between the rule of law and human rights, but I think where it's in the small and medium enterprise where the economic activity can at that point leave the formal area and go into the informal area, and with all of the problems associated with human rights that exist. It doesn't begin with the larger corporations or even their first tier or second tier of the supply chain, but it does go on to that. Now, the other thing, I heard a couple of times the word shared value, which of course is one of the buzzwords currently in fashion in the CSR world. I've also seen that morph into something even more intriguing called shared responsibility. And one of the things that I think is one of the implications of the guiding principles is responsibility is something you don't share. You don't share it with the state, and you don't share it with other companies. Your responsibility is for your impacts, and it doesn't get shared at all. Thanks.
For that comment. I want to invite another question or comment. Ms. Magdalena Slavejkova, Titan Group.
Yes, thank you. I was, in fact, my question was for Mr. Wilton, but after his first presentation, then after with the second, he gave me the answer on the question. However, I will say, because I have applied for this, it was
or we can move on to the next one.
It was very interesting with states and with the laws and having everything in the laws. And I must say that I'm coming from Macedonia, and in our country, practically with the law on labor and health and safety law, which you have mentioned for New Zealand, it was very interesting for me. Majority of the human rights are covered, and it is so strict. And the state has managed with the law on health and safety somehow to be observed, and the companies to have compliance. However, it is not with the labor law the same. And I'm asking how practically, how through the instruments, the state cannot have that much of inspectors to go after all the medium and small enterprises or companies, I can say small companies. They are of 5 or 10 employees, especially in civil works, which are especially with a high risk, let's say, to have to reach the compliance with the law. Also, I would like to mention that the human rights are so big issue, and really everybody, it has to be covered by the state, of course. But now the UN, I believe, has so big task to implement it through all institutions, all associations, networks, and everything that they have as instrument, because really it has to be put in everybody's insight, to be in everybody's core values, which we have the children from 7 years of age having their values. So this competency building really is crucial, and it will last for years, I believe.
Thank you very much. One more question or comment. Sabina or Satina, I don't know if I spelling it correctly.
Sabina.
Timko from UNEP Finance Initiative.
Yes, I would like also to make a comment, so it's not a question, because there was a lot of discussion on the drivers and the actors that can contribute to better awareness and increased capacity of SMEs for human rights issues. And I think that one actor that is being overlooked in this discussion is the finance sector. The finance actors are actually business facilitators. So I work for the UNEP Finance Initiative, which is basically a partnership between the UN and the finance community, looking at how to integrate environmental, social, and governance issues in financial decision making. And human rights is part of the social element. And one of the feedback that we receive from our members, namely banks, is that when they try to engage with SMEs, they encounter a lot of difficulty. Due to lack of awareness and lack of capacity building. So they are taking the tasks on their own for their own policies to explaining to clients why is it important to embark on human rights as part of the social element. So I just wanted to mention that so that you don't underestimate the importance and to also take the finance sector into account when you talk about this, and also to say that the business associations are indeed having a very important role in collaborating also maybe with finance institutions. When there is a regulation in place for the finance sector, it will most certainly affect the clients, including SMEs. So it's good for these actors to work together. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now ask the respondents whether they have any comment to these comments. Amanda, please.
Yes, I just wanted to finish by saying that it is important to bear in mind that human rights is something that it's important not only for business but for those who have been victimized, and it's important to not to forget those victims, and to have the national human rights institutions together with governments, business associations, and the Global Compact and other UN bodies involved in this issue is very central, and will provide perhaps something that Tom said, the remedy side of the pillars that the principles have put forward for us to really start practicing and investigating what's going on in the field with these small and medium enterprises. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Brent has a comment.
Just to come back to the national human rights institutions, I think this is very important, and one of the things that the working group can look at is to provide this sort of one-stop shop. People need to know where to go to get some information. At the national level, you may not be so well known. It depends on where you are, but it's a very important thing, because it was mentioned earlier that what we do has to work properly within the context of the country and its legal system. So the best place to make sure you're doing that is to be working with the local actors who know that system. So I think that's very important. The other issue about labour law and just issues of law generally, we need to build compliance cultures. I mean, that's how Switzerland operates, largely on a compliance culture. It's been built up over years. And the first thing is knowledge of the law. Do people know what the law is? I mean, I've been working in this area now for nearly 30 years, and in many instances what I've come across is ignorance. Not bad intent, just ignorant. Didn't know what the law was, didn't know what the expectation was, never thought about it before, but once you tell them what it is, okay. So you start to build a compliance culture. We have to do that with human rights as well.
Okay, I was informed by the session facilitator from the Secretariat that we can have additional 5 minutes. So I will invite a few more questions. Daira Gomez, CGSJJ.
Suggested.
Okay.
Yes. My name is Daira Gomez. I work for Sugesti. We are an NGO in Central America, and we support small and medium-sized companies to respect human rights and to implement decent work practices. And my specific question is, in our region, I don't believe that the state alone can't have the duty, can have the ability to protect all of us. Then I think we need to work together with other stakeholders groups. Then my question is, do you have any kind of experience in developing countries where labor organizations, civil society, business organizations and the states work together to promote the implementation of the respect of human rights?
Thanks for that. Another possible question from Catherine Hagen, GSO.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Catherine Hagen with the Global Social Observatory. And I found this session to be very, very useful in terms of understanding the unique challenges of working with SMEs. Excellent presentations across the board. And I would suggest that building on that, there might be some useful thinking that goes into the kinds of ways in which SMEs themselves can express what they need. There isn't that much that has come out in this discussion about their perspective. It's sort of like a delivery to them, but I think we should be thinking about a response and getting from them what they can do to make a difference. And in particular, there are issues of cost that are important for SMEs that may not be there for the larger enterprises in terms of compliance. And certainly the kinds of networking that you've been talking about are crucial for all of this to be implemented, but it is crucially, I think, important to think about that perspective from coming up. Thanks.
Thank you very much. One last question, Alexandra Costa, Costa Consulting Service.
I'm presently closing a project in Iraq with a survey of more than 500 enterprises, small enterprises. Only 10% of such enterprises are registered. The other belong to what they call black economy. But in many corners of the world, black economy is economy. My only question is, I have heard about a guide on how to make the small and medium enterprises understand and perceive the importance of human rights. I fully agree. But I really doubt that the guide means a written document could be very effective in respect to small and medium entrepreneurs that have no time to read, no time to go deeper into the subject. Reputation agents and other intermediate institutions like Chamber of Commerce, in my opinion, are much more important. But I would like to understand if some of the panelists have other comments on tools, on appropriate tools to make this, let's say, perception and understanding of the human rights by the SMEs could work much more. Thank you.
I'm sorry that I had to get at him so strongly, but listening to this discussion today, I can only draw one conclusion, and that should mean that education needs to start at a much, much earlier level, say at school. And since we had some comments from Latin America, we had some of the members here, they had the opportunity to be in Rio +20, and it was the Brazilian government that showed where they start, because they have developed new school books where human rights are already presented and to the children, and this is where things have to start, from my opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any comments from the panel? Yeah, Ricardo, you can do all.
No, I'll just come back to the issue of labor inspectorates and bringing stakeholders together. That is a function that the ILO plays and tries to support the capacity building of member states, and they do so with the tripartite partners, often in a process called social dialogue. We try to do that everywhere at a national level. And certainly resources are never sufficient, and in terms of labor and inspectorate, it's a big issue. We don't want to see, resources being diverted from a process of building capacity and adding to labor inspectorates to total voluntary initiative kind of materials and production. So that's a comment there. In terms of specific tools, I would point people, I will plug, we have a website, ILO/business. There, the tools that are adapted in the language of business users have all been posted, and there's also FAQs on a variety of subjects on the implementation of labor standards. So there are resources available, but as always, never enough.
Just very quickly on tools, no one's got it right yet, so I think it's a responsibility we all have, is to try things, share things, put them on a common platform, be able to adapt them and use them and just develop this over time. But there's no one good tool yet that I'm aware of that works better than any other.
With that note, I would like to close this session. I would like to remind and ask all of you to step out outside of this room just after we finish. Our session was postponed for 15 minutes because people stayed here and continued discussions in the room. So please, thank you very much for your participation.